Back when I was attending a university, I used to work on campus at one of the dining halls during the night shift. I lived in the next town over, since it was cheaper to live in a crappy little apartment out of town than to live on campus in the dorms. But I didn't own a car, so I had to take the bus. One night, I had just gotten off a shift at work. My feet were killing me and I was completely exhausted. As I slowly made my way to the bus stop, I noticed a man much older than me sitting on one of the two benches at the otherwise empty bus stop. But I didn't pay too much attention to him. I simply sat down on the second bench and listened to some music while waiting for the bus to arrive. The first sign that things were starting to get weird was when I kept noticing out of the corner of my eye that he was staring at me. At first, I thought I might be imagining it. So I looked over and caught him quickly turning his head to look away. Okay, so he was staring at me. This wasn't completely out of the ordinary, since being a young college girl seemed to gain me a bit of attention from older men. So like usual, I just ignored him. That was a mistake. Again, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him look at me. But instead of just staring this time, he got up and walked over to sit next to me instead. I continued listening to my music, hoping that he'd see the earbuds and take the hint that I wasn't interested in having a conversation. Instead, this man literally took the earbud out of my ear. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said as my head snapped to look at him in shock. I should have told him off for touching my things and demanded he leave me alone, but I was sort of frozen and didn't want to make him mad. He started introducing himself as Mike and telling me that he lived in the area and it was always nice to see pretty girls like me at the university bus stop. He explained that he was a real man, unlike the boys I went to school with, and that I should go home with him that night. I was a shy, scared virgin who had never had a man be as bold as this to my face. I say to my face, because I had certainly gotten my fair share of unsolicited private pictures online by that point, but I digress. I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. But that didn't stop Mike from continuing to explain to me all of the fun things he wanted to do with me at his place that night. He got into graphic detail. The things he described started out with basic things you'd expect, and escalated to him asking if I liked being choked until I turned purple and passed out in bed. I wish there were anyone else at that bus stop, but it was just the two of us, in the dark alone, as I counted the seconds until the bus would arrive. Then Mike took things to a different level of shocking by telling me, "Listen, the demons want me to ask for your phone number, and they say you should give it to me or you won't like what happens." He actually had the audacity to start stroking my hair. His hand was gentle, but I didn't want him touching me at all. This was shocking for a number of reasons. The demons? I wouldn't like what would happen? Why was he touching me? What the hell was this guy talking about? As though he could read my mind, Mike went on to explain, "My therapist knows the demons are real. I told her about them and she says I'm not crazy and the demons are real." He laughed, then abruptly stopped. "Now give me your phone number like they said," he demanded. And as his hand stroked my hair for the last time, he stopped and gripped the back of my neck. Still gentle, but even more terrifying. I was scared, and obviously didn't want him to have my phone number. But he was taking out his phone, and I knew that he was going to call the number I gave him to make sure I wasn't lying to him. And he still had his hand on the back of my neck, so I reluctantly gave him my real phone number. Stupid, I know. But I was right, and he immediately called to check. All I could think about was just not making this guy angry long enough to get away from him. Then I'd block his number. Thankfully, the bus came moments later. I sat down as close to the front of the bus near the bus driver as I possibly could, since the bus was basically empty. Mike decided to sit directly across from me. At this point, I had tried listening to music again, hoping that being on the bus and him having my phone number would signal to him the end of our conversation. However, he decided to reach over and unzip my sweatshirt. revealing my work shirt and the name tag which I had unfortunately forgotten to remove in my haste to leave work that night. I hadn't told him my name yet. Abigail, what a beautiful name. Our daughter will be named Celeste. I shouldn't have been shocked at this point, but I was. I had stopped listening to music again and zipped my sweatshirt back up, which made him laugh. You won't need that soon anyway, he said, and winked at me, implying how he'd planned to undress me even further that night. At one stop, Mike tried to convince me to get off the bus with him. I told him no, that I was tired and just wanted to go home, so he said okay, and stayed on the bus. I knew that had been his stop, so the fact that he was staying on the bus worried me. I was sure this meant that he was planning on coming home with me instead. Baby, Mike whispered to me. I tried to ignore him, but he repeated himself louder. Baby! He had the most unsettling smile on his face as I asked, What? He laughed and told me, The demons say you smell nice. I was terrified and felt like I was going to throw up by the time my bus stop arrived. I lived in an apartment alone and didn't want him to know where I lived. Despite my body being exhausted and sore from work, adrenaline kicked in and I bolted off the bus and ran straight home. I made it inside and locked the door. I looked through the peephole and didn't see him, so I went to carefully peek out of my window and saw him standing near the bus stop, looking around. He took out his phone, and sure enough, I started getting a call from an unknown number since I hadn't saved his number. I ignored it. When he hung up, I started getting several texts, asking where I'd gone, how he didn't like hide and seek, and how the demons just wanted to have fun, but I was being a little bitch about it. I was so scared because he knew which apartment building I lived in, where I worked, where I went to school, my phone number, and my name. The only good thing which made me feel slightly relieved was that he didn't know which specific apartment number I lived in. That's when he started yelling outside. There were no specific words said, just wordless yells of what I can only assume were frustration and anger. I blocked his number and kept all the lights in my apartment off as I cried with my back to the front door. Maybe I should have called the police, but my brain was so frazzled that I didn't even think of that until the next day. And by then all I knew about him was that he was a mentally unstable man, probably named Mike, who hadn't actually done any physical harm to me, so I didn't think it was worth it. In hindsight, I know that I made a lot of stupid mistakes during this experience. I ended up moving away entirely at the end of that term of school for unrelated reasons, but until then I switched to day shifts at work and was paranoid every night. Thankfully, I never saw the man again, though. So Mike, the scary guy from the bus stop who tried to follow me home, I never want to meet you or your demons ever again. This happened when I was a bartender about 4 years ago, but I think about it often and has changed the way I operate throughout life. I now refuse to go to any store alone after midnight. For the story's sake, I will tell you that I was 25 and an attractive blonde at the time. On a busy Friday night, I was bartending with the bar manager and he had noticed that we were very low on some bar necessities after the dinner rush. So I was sent out to go to a 24-hour grocery store down the road to pick up the odds and ends that we would require to get us through the weekend. I picked up everything that was asked of me without trouble at the store until I got to the liquor aisle. There were two country-looking guys that were probably around my age in the aisle, and they were staring at me and whispering to each other in a way that made me uncomfortable, as I assumed they were making comments about me. All pretty innocent so far. Before they could approach me, I grabbed what I needed very quickly and power walked to the self-checkout. I really booked it out of there because when you're a bartender, it's kind of like you are on stage and are required to be charming and interact with people that you otherwise absolutely wouldn't be able to tolerate unless you're getting paid to. Thus, why I am not a bartender anymore. I get to the self-checkout and hot on my tail are the two guys. I'm scanning my stuff and they use the scanning station next to me. I get a better look at them now that they are right next to me. One is taller, muscular, and average looking. The other is shorter and more plump. They both looked dirty and their eyes were completely bloodshot. Not sure if they were high on something or had already been drinking for a while. They continued to stare at me and our eyes awkwardly met. So I did the pleasant, Midwestern thing to do and flashed them a quick half-assed closed-lipped smile to be polite. The taller one starts trying to talk to me. "Hey, looks like you're ready to party, huh?" I replied with something like, "Yeah, something like that. It's not for me though." They walk closer to me and ignore their responsibility to scan their items. "Oh, must be for your boyfriend, huh?" I flash the awkward tight-lipped smile again and roll my eyes slightly. Like, "This is your hint that I am not interested, fellas." The taller one continues to try to talk to me. "You could come hang out with us tonight. We could show you a real good time if you know what I mean." I reply with, "No thanks, I'm good. I have plans already." Well, the tall one starts to get upset that his moves aren't working like he'd hoped and starts using a more threatening tone and moves very close to me, like 2 inches away, but I ignore him, staying focused on the scanner. I don't think he had showered in a few days by the smell of him. He gets a little louder and says, "I see how it is. You probably only fuck doctors and rich men like that. You think you're too good for us. We can show you that you aren't. We can teach you a lesson." Now, I'm not sure in what context he meant, but it definitely wasn't good. Still not looking at him, I turn away so my body is blocking his view of my purse, which I set on the scanner, to grab my 4-inch pocket knife out and slide it up my jacket sleeve in case I need to protect myself, acting like I am searching for my wallet. I do this, however, in view of the self-scan worker standing at her podium and look at her with wide eyes trying to communicate that I do not feel safe and I might need help. I turn back to the machine and slide my credit card to pay, while the creepy and hostile guys are practically standing on top of me. The machine malfunctions and starts beeping. The lady worker comes over immediately and the guys standing next to me change their expressions from, "I am planning to torture you for a couple days and toss your body in a creek," to, "Just your friendly good old country boys making polite conversation over here." They actually tried to act like I knew them and we were friends so the worker wouldn't be alerted to their ill intentions. They tried joking with the worker saying I was stealing something and that's why the machine went off. The worker was definitely not buying it. She was a 6-plus-foot tall woman with some muscle on her, by the way. I wouldn't mess with her on my best day anyways. She presses a few buttons on the screen, shooting the guys a very unimpressed look when they were trying to act charming, and cancels the order completely. She turns to me and says, "I am sorry for the inconvenience, ma'am. This machine seems to be not working correctly. Why don't you gather your things and I will ring you up at an actual register." She puts her hand on my back and gives me a wide, I'd look like I gave her a minute earlier, letting me know that she sees I am in danger. I pick up my things to follow her to a register that is near the security office. The guys linger around the self-scan, still glaring at me, and eventually complete their purchase, but stand at the exit assuming they are waiting for me. I felt like I would be walking to my death if I made my exit in that moment. The worker keeps a close eye on the guys and scans my items. As she's scanning, she tells me there really wasn't anything wrong with the machine I was using. It just misread my credit card. She said, "I had a bad feeling about those guys from the moment they walked in, and then I saw them getting aggressive towards you. I already rang security to be ready to walk out to the parking lot and make sure you left safely when you were ready to leave. Then I saw you take that knife out and put it up your sleeve, getting ready to protect yourself. Good girl. As much as I'd like to see you show them they picked the wrong chick to mess with, I'm glad I was able to pull you aside and make sure you were safe. I see them waiting by the door for you. I'll just keep pressing buttons on the screen and act like I'm having trouble with your order until they give up and go outside. Our security officer and I are both still going to escort you to your vehicle when you leave." I thought to myself, this woman seriously deserves a raise. I thanked her over and over again and told her what they said to me, and I was getting afraid because I don't know what these guys are capable of. As I'm talking to her, my bar manager calls me to see what's taking so long. I explained what was happening, and he was obviously very concerned and ready to come up there himself and kick some ass. A sweet sentiment, indeed. By the time I hang up, the guys had given up and walked out to the parking lot. The worker said to give it another few minutes because she had a feeling they may still be in the parking lot waiting for me to walk out and see which vehicle was mine so they could follow me. My instant thought was, no way, they have to be gone by now. I was wrong. The worker and security guard escort me out, and as it was after midnight, you can imagine how empty the parking lot was. Towards the back of the lot, there sat an old big pickup truck running with the lights on pointed towards the store. It was a huge parking lot, and it wouldn't have made sense for them to initially park like that, so I'm assuming they moved the truck to sit that way so they had a full view of when I exited the store to go to my vehicle. It was like being stalked by very hungry lions. When I unlocked my car and they saw that me, the worker, and the guard were looking directly at them and that I wasn't getting in my car until we watched them leave, they then peeled out of the parking lot. I mean, they seriously did a burnout to establish that they were pissed and trying to intimidate us or something. A poor creeps didn't get their way. I thanked the worker and the guard over and over again, as I am certain they had just saved my life or at least saved me from having to live with whatever those guys were planning on doing to me. I did write a long letter to the store manager and to their corporate location describing how their employees protected me and how grateful I was. I really hope that earned her a promotion, bonus, or raise. She didn't know me at all and was ready to protect me, which really isn't her job, but she did it anyways. Needless to say, I do not go late night shopping by myself anymore. Never will again. A little over a year ago, I had a job working overnight at a gas station close to my house. I'm a woman and was 31 at the time. I know, to some it seems unsafe for a woman to work graveyard shift by herself. However, it was a slow store and the sheriff's office was about 20 feet across from it. I really didn't think I would have that many problems. There would be about 30 customers in an 8-hour shift, and that was on a busier night. It was about 3:30 in the morning. I went outside to sweep the parking lot and last-minute check the trash. It was time for a cigarette and I had one headphone in, kinda jamming out. Across the road in the parking lot of the sheriff's office, I saw a figure with his back to me. He was swaying back and forth while looking down. Honestly, it looked like he was enjoying a much-needed piss. Against the sheriff's office, though? Yeah, the building closed at 4 p.m. and didn't open again till 6 the next morning, but why? By the back of his ripped white t-shirt, I remembered that he had come in about 4 hours earlier. He was a total creep, and I could already tell he had a good buzz going. I didn't say anything. I just took my eyes off of him and tried not to draw attention to myself. It was working until a car pulled in. I was still outside as they pulled up. I saw him look at the car and then at me and back and forth again. As the customer was leaving, I walked her outside. I still had half a smoke burning and had left my dustpan outside with the squeegee. We both heard him start to swear angrily and seemingly engage in an argument with himself. She looked across the road and told me to be careful. I made an awkward joke about him being the one who should be more afraid of me or something like that. The man was still there but closer to the road, now facing the parking lot of my store. Whatever he's yelling was completely unintelligible. He was obviously very drunk and can barely stand straight, still swaying away. I didn't engage him, but I didn't take my eyes off of him this time. I just slowly walked back into the store. Something about his face really bothered me. It had a darkness to it, but his eyes looked wild. My experience during graveyard jobs has been that the crazy-eyed ones are the worst ones. I didn't like it at all and wanted no part of it. I still had almost 3 hours to go in two before any other employees got there. Instantly, I went to the computer and typed up a temporarily closed sign just in case he wanted trouble. I was coming around the counter on my way to the doors when I saw that he'd walked across the road to my side now. I literally just barely got the second door locked when he stumbled into our very small parking lot. My hand mimed the hand signal for cut across my neck. basically saying, "Nope, sorry you can't come in here. We're closed." I shook my head back and forth too, hoping to further discourage him. He started walking away but screamed something at me while he's walking. I don't mean he was grumpy and shouted at me or yelled that I was an asshole or anything. I mean like he was at an enraged volume and was violently throwing his hands everywhere. Definitely knowing I'm in the wrong shift of the wrong job, I got really skeeved out. I decided to call the cops. It's a good thing too, because the minute I hung up with them, there he comes again up to the door. He starts pulling and banging on it. He backs up and runs into it trying to ram it. Not that it would have done any good. I made the mistake of telling him that I had called the cops and his ass was about to be grass. I say I made the mistake of telling him because once I said that, he took off. The police never found him. They drove around the road and surrounding neighborhoods for over an hour but found no one. He was on foot, so I don't get where he could have gone to. He didn't harm me, and with them not finding him, I didn't fill out a police report or anything. I was safe behind thick glass doors that were locked for the rest of my shift. It just sucked. Maybe if I didn't warn him ahead of time, I wouldn't have had to spend the last 3 months of my job constantly looking over my shoulder. I'll never know what the right choice was. I'm just glad I don't work there anymore. When I was 20 years old, I worked as a delivery girl for a pretty popular pizzeria in my area. Initially, I worked the late morning to mid-afternoon shift, but when the guy who delivered for the night shift ended up getting fired due to him losing his license because of a DUI, I was placed on the night shift since my boss hired a family friend who could only work my shift for whatever reason. I really didn't want this shift because you never know if people who order late at night actually want a pizza or if they have other intentions in mind. Unfortunately, my boss was an asshole and essentially told me if I wasn't willing to work the night shift, I was fired. I wasn't exactly in a position where I could be out of work, albeit temporarily, so I reluctantly worked the shift. The first month of this shift went by without any issues until I had to deliver a pizza to a house that just barely made our delivery radius. I punch it in on my GPS and the house was located in a pretty suburban part of the city. I arrive and it's about 11 p.m. The block was extremely quiet, decently lit, and mostly littered with modern townhouses, but the house I delivered to was a duplex. I ring the doorbell and wait for about 30 seconds. No answer. I ring it again and wait another 30 seconds. Still no answer. I'm standing there getting pretty nervous that something's about to go down. But thankfully a man opens the door. He looked like he was in his late 40s. He was pretty tall, maybe a little over 6 foot, and he was very skinny. I tell him his pizza is here and he just stands there staring at me. I asked him if he was okay and he responded by saying, "Yeah, I'm fine, sorry. I got off work not too long ago and I'm zoning out a bit." Fair enough, I suppose. He hands me the money. I hand him the pizza, and as I'm making change he says, "You're really beautiful, you know that?" Not really thinking too much into it, I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his change. I said good night and he did too. I walked back to my car and finished my deliveries for the night. A few days later, I get a delivery order to the same place. I head over there around the same time as last time and ring the doorbell. He answers the door very excitedly and said, "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" I told him I was tired and can't wait to go home, to which he chuckled and said, "I know that feeling pretty well," as he was pulling out his wallet. As he's counting his money, he asks me what my name is. Being kinda tired at this point and not really thinking straight, I stupidly tell him my name. As I'm making change, he asks if he could have my number as he'd love to hang out with someone as gorgeous as I am. Whoa, buddy, pump the brakes. I've literally only met this guy like twice to deliver a pizza. I had no idea who this guy was, and I'm positive he barely knew who I was as well. Another thing to mention is that I looked way younger than I was at the time. I was told by numerous people that I still looked like I was 15, and I was hoping he thought differently and wasn't hitting on what he thought was a teenager. I'm just standing there awkwardly for a few seconds before I muster out, "Sorry, I have a boyfriend." He gets upset and says, "Oh, okay. I see." We stand there in silence before I tell him to have a good night and walk back to my car. He says nothing and still stands at the doorway staring at me until he finally went back inside once I started my car. I got a pretty creepy vibe from this guy and even brought it up to my coworkers, and they agreed it was pretty creepy. Except for my boss, who overheard everything and claimed I was making up stories and trying to gain sympathy for having to take the shift. Fucking asshole. A week later, as I'm working the night shift, and we get an order from the same guy again, and this is when shit finally hits the fan. I arrive at the house at around 10:30 p.m. and keep in mind that from my perspective on the road, it didn't look like a single light in that house was on. I get out of my car and I walk to the front door with the pizza box in my arms. As I'm approaching the door, it quickly swings open to reveal the man, except this time he was wearing a suit and I jumped back. He laughs and said, "Sorry if I scared you. I saw you out the window and figured I'd just open the door now so that you wouldn't have to ring the bell. I was getting scared because, as I mentioned before, there were no lights on in the house, so was he sitting in the dark this whole time? And if so, why?" I nervously laugh and say it's okay. He asked me if I liked his suit, to which I said yes. He then asks me, "Would you like to go on a date with me tonight?" "What the fuck?" I once again tell him I have a boyfriend, to which he chuckles, gets close to me and says, "Honey, there's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship. If you go on a date with me, I'll show you how a real man treats a girl." He grabs the pizza box from me and throws it to the side and grabs me by my arms hard. I'm officially shitting bricks at this point and trying not to cry from the fear that was overwhelming me. I start pleading with him, "Dude, please, I just want to go home. I don't want to go on a date tonight." He just stares at me with the most sinister look I've seen on someone's face and says, "I don't care. Get inside now. We're gonna have a good time." He starts trying to pull me into the house, and I'm trying to resist as hard as I can. After a bit of struggling, he lets go of one of my arms and starts grabbing something out of his pocket, which I presumed was a knife. I did something that to this day I am still thankful worked as he was doing that. I used my free arm to punch him as hard as I could in his stomach. This stuns him for a few seconds and he loosened his grip on me, allowing me to break free. I quickly run to my car, and as I get in he runs at me and tries pulling me out of the car, holding the knife in the other arm, and even yells, "Why are you making this so fucking difficult?" I grab a half-empty soda bottle I had in the cup holder and throw it, and luckily it hits his head and he lets me go. I slam the door, and then all of a sudden he jumps right on the hood of my car and starts scratching and banging on my windshield with his knife. I put the car in reverse and quickly back out of the spot and quickly reverse down the road with him desperately trying to hold on. He's banging on my hood screaming, "Stop the fucking car!" I turn on to the next road as swiftly as possible, and luckily he falls off the hood of my car. I slammed the gas as hard as I could to get as far away from that sick bastard as I could. In my panic state, I drove a couple blocks down the street and kept making turn after turn onto other side blocks as I feared I was being followed. Eventually, I reached a red light and I slammed on the brakes and just sat at the intersection frozen from what had just happened. I began crying and violently shaking as I was sitting there. It dawned on me that I came so close to losing my life, and I couldn't help but feel like I shouldn't have been alive. Once the light turned green, the first pulled over to the side and just sat there crying. Eventually, I get the energy to drive back to the pizzeria, and almost immediately after I walk in, my coworker knew something was wrong after seeing me. I practically broke down in front of him, and everyone else came to the front wondering what was going on. I fought my tears and explained everything that had just happened. My coworker comforted me, and my boss surprised me and began apologizing profusely for what had happened and for putting me on the night shift. He took me into the office and handed me the phone to call the cops. They arrive at the store and I give them my statement, as well as taking pictures of any marks on myself as well as scratches on my car from the encounter as evidence. My coworker followed behind me as I drove home, and I collapsed on my bed, and strangely enough, I managed to fall asleep. I quit my job the next day, and luckily a friend of mine managed to hook me up with a new job at her clothing store. As far as the psycho goes, 2 days later I receive an update from the police. The entire duplex was owned by the guy's brother, who lived on the right side with his wife, and the psycho lived on the left side of the duplex. I learned that he had been in and out of jail constantly, at first for robberies and assaults, but later on it was for sex crimes. He had been released from jail about 5 months before this encounter for having sex with a minor. When they arrived at the house, he was long gone and his family had no idea where he ran off to. But the police insisted they would find him. And indeed they did, albeit not alive. I spent the next 2 months in fear that he would find me and finish what he had in mind. But the police contacted me and updated me on the case. Apparently he fled to another city nearby and attempted to kidnap a teenager walking alone late at night on the street. Luckily somebody happened to be looking out the window at the right time, called the cops, and the police caught him trying to force her into his car. He manages to flee and the police chase after him. He blew a red light near a busy boulevard and a van slammed right into the driver's side of his car. By some sort of miracle, the driver of the van only sustained minor injuries, while the psycho succumbed to his wounds long before the ambulance even arrived. I thanked the officers for everything they did and for informing me, and I walked out of the station. I walk down the street and I light up a cigarette as I'm taking in everything I had just been told. I don't wish death on people, but after hearing about his death, I felt relieved. I felt relieved that he couldn't hurt anyone anymore. I was relieved that I would never have to encounter him ever again, and that I wouldn't have to go through with charging him and reliving what happened that night. My last experience 2 years before this was scary, but I think this one takes the cake as being the scariest, as I was alone and face to face with this psycho. Who knows where I'd be if he managed to pull me into his house. This happened a good few years ago. I was in my early 20s, single and living by myself. Most of my family lived about a 4-hour drive away from me. I was working for a small call center that provided, among other things, phone services for a 24-hour plumbing company, so they needed someone on the line at all times. My shift ran from 8 p.m. to whenever my boss showed up to pick up the line, which was usually 6 a.m. I worked in a building that housed several businesses of the same sort. Call center work mostly, though we were the only one that had 24-hour services. Because of budget cuts, I was always the only operator on my floor. The only people in the building at night were myself and the security guy who came by to do his rounds twice a night. Now, because the line had to be on 24/7, I was never allowed to disconnect while I was there. I ran to and from the bathroom, ate meals sitting in front of the computer, and every once in a while sneaked a cigarette at the window within sight of the screen. Only the light above my computer was on. Everything else was turned off when everyone went away around 10 p.m., so I was left in this half-darkness beneath a spotlight. I desperately needed that job to support myself, so despite the crap conditions I kept repeating that it wasn't that bad. Things were usually quiet after 10 p.m., I could use the extra hours on my paycheck and didn't need to get a second job. I did a lot of reading and even considered going back to school because if nothing else, the night shift would afford me plenty of time to study. So one night, around 2 a.m. or so, I got a call. I introduced myself as I always did. "Hello? You were calling so and so. My name is Jill. How may I help you?" The guy on the other side repeated my name and hung up. Working phone services on the night shift, you get used to a lot of weird stuff, so I shrugged it off and went back to my book. Then he called again and asked if he was speaking to Jill. I said yes, repeated the company name and asked how may I help. He hangs up. The third time around he asks if this is Jill on the phone, and I ask to whom I'm speaking. He hangs up again. The next time he calls, he's breathing hard on the phone and tells me he wants me to talk to him and he's not going to hurt me. I jot down his phone number and I start hanging up whenever his call pops up, which was the better part of an hour. This went on for months. When he realized I was hanging up every time I saw that number, he began calling from a restricted number, meaning I never knew if it was a legit call, and ended up answering. All the time this guy keeps saying he wants me to talk to him and that he's not gonna hurt me. The one time I counted, I hung up on this guy over 200 times in one night. Every time he would call, I'd say the company name, and as soon as I heard him, I hung up. I complained to my boss and she did nothing. Instead, she laughed the whole thing off because this guy obviously didn't know where I was, and he was only a voice on the line and I was perfectly safe. Some time into this, I started talking to coworkers, and here's where it started getting really creepy. He never called on my days off, when someone else would be covering my shift. Indeed, at one point I changed shifts with a coworker to attend a wedding, and he didn't call that day. As time went by, I was getting pretty spooked by the whole situation and the fact my boss did zero to try and stop this. My coworkers were sympathetic and told me that if my boss did nothing, I should file a complaint myself. But I'm not sure I could, since this wasn't happening on my personal number. None of them could really walk me home since I was the only operator in night shift. Everyone else was gone by the time my boss arrived and I left the office. I got a little paranoid because obviously this guy knew my schedule pretty well, and even if I changed shifts, he would only call if he knew I was on the line. It had to be someone who could see me. I started doing commute with my cell phone in hand at all times with the emergency number dialed in. Sometimes I did the whole commute on the phone with friends or relatives to keep calm. Since it's illegal to carry pepper spray here, at one point I considered walking around with a box cutter in my purse. That's how afraid I was. One day before my shift started, I was at the entrance of the building smoking a cigarette before going up, and I see the security guy come by, same fellow who usually did the night shift, this huge guy. I didn't really know him, never spoke much to him, only said good evening or goodbye when I went by his desk and whenever he came to my floor to do his rounds. I usually kept to myself and I never really made small talk or anything, just greeted him out of politeness and he greeted back. He asked for a light, so I gave him my lighter, and he told me he'd been fired and he was going home. And he went on to tell me he always got the impression I was afraid of him since I was never friendly or welcoming. Then he told me he was never gonna hurt me, and just walked away. I lost every drop of blood I had in me. I went inside to tell my boss the whole thing and discovered the guy got fired for harassing women in other floors, going as far as trying to corner someone in one of the elevators. The complaints piled up and he lost his job. Most of the time his shifts matched mine, so he would see me come in at 8 p.m. and left before I did. I asked my boss for that phone number again to come forward on this guy, asked the security company if that was his number. She told me she threw it away. When I told her the whole story, she found it cute. Then she asked me if I was sure it was him, because a voice on the phone is different and maybe you got it wrong. Quality assurance told us time and again that our every call was recorded, so I demanded recordings. That's when I found out that, again, because of budget cuts and whatnot, the night shift was never recorded, so I had no evidence. Once the guy was fired, the calls stopped. I didn't work there for much longer after that. So yeah, I have this guy's face imprinted in my mind. Hope I never see him again.